We're going to talk about the relationship between price elasticity of demand and revenue. This diagram is an average revenue curve, which is also a demand curve. This is the entirety of the demand curve because it is attached to the X and the Y axis. So this is the full length of the demand curve. That means that the elasticity of demand is constantly varying as we move along the curve. So if we go right to the top of the average revenue or demand curve where it cuts the y-axis, the PED will be infinite. Then as we move down through the top half, as it were, of the average revenue curve, the PED is greater than 1, relatively elastic up there. And then we get to the middle of the average revenue curve and the PED is equal to 1. As we move down to the bottom half of the demand curve, the average revenue curve, we'll see that the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. It's relatively inelastic. And then when we hit the x-axis, the price elasticity of demand is 0. So just to be clear, the average revenue curve and the demand curve are the same thing. On a straight line demand curve such as this, the PED is constantly varying. The PED is higher at the top of the demand curve and lower at the bottom of the demand curve. Here we have a marginal revenue curve which relates to the average revenue curve that we've just looked at. The marginal revenue curve is always twice the gradient of its corresponding average revenue curve. So this marginal revenue curve cuts the x-axis at 50, whereas the average revenue curve cut the axis at 100. Where the marginal revenue curve is positive, that means that the PED must be greater than 1. It must be relatively elastic. And where it's negative, the PED must be less than 1. It must be relatively inelastic. So if we're in the elastic portion of the marginal revenue curve and we were to cut price, that means that revenue would rise because of that elasticity. If we were to cut price in the negative part of the marginal revenue curve, then revenue would fall because the PED is inelastic. Just to finish things off, here we have a total revenue curve, and we can see here that the total revenue rises until we hit 50, and then it falls to 100. So the first part of the total revenue curve relates to the positive part of the marginal revenue curve, the top part of the average revenue curve where PED is greater than 1. Where the total revenue curve is at its maximum, that's the equivalent to the marginal revenue curve cutting the x-axis and halfway along the average revenue curve, so PED equals 1. And where we have the total revenue falling, the PED must be less than 1, so that's like the negative part of the marginal revenue curve and the lower half of the average revenue curve.